absolutely glorious morning here in the Durban Harbour. Thanks so much for tuning in to Morning Live. And we are back here, and we're here for the inaugural Maritime Sector Dialogues, which Minister Bladen Zimande has initiated to find out exactly what are some of the obstacles to transformation and also the optimal beneficial gains to be had from this particular sector. And just looking out on what is going on, quite a bit of activity, as you can see to the left there in the background, all the containers here, and I understand about 0.1% of those containers of just over 1.2 million actually do get lost at sea. And I was asking what happens when that actually does occur, and I was told by Mr. Tilai that these containers, when they do fall over, they actually do not sink. So they are just under the surface of the water, and then they pose great danger to some of the vessels at sea, because you can actually hit them and rip open the bottom of the craft, which is what leads to ships sinking. So very interesting developments, and of course information being shared here this morning. But right now I want to talk about some of the regulatory affairs, and joining me is Mr. Mahesh Fakir, who is the CEO of the port regulator in South Africa. Thanks so much for coming through.
Good morning, Sakina. It's good to be here on Morning Live in Durban, and welcome to Durban. Thank you.
So we are looking at various touch points with regard to these conversations, the dialogues that will be taking place over the next 2 days. But just from a port regulator's perspective, what do you think are some of the important takeaways to note? What would basically encompass your role as the regulator?
Thank you. Our role as a regulator is economic regulation in South Africa. So we do a lot of economic analysis, tariff setting, but part of transformation is regulating the equity of access. So you want to ensure that there is equity of access to all role players, to all participants in the economy. And some of the things that we've done to ensure that there's greater access, as well as to bring down port pricing, is in our economic regulation role itself. So just to give you an example, in November we published the latest tariff, and it was a decrease of 6.27% across the port system. That allows the cost of living for South Africans to come down, as well as to make it easier for the South African entrepreneurs to do business overseas. So it brings down the cost of doing business as well. I think in line with President Ramaphosa's call to look at port-administered prices amongst other administered prices in South Africa, we've managed to reduce the prices to make it easier for South Africans. We've also introduced...
If I may just interject,
yes.
What does that mean in real terms to me, to the viewers sitting at home? If I want to, say, import one container of whatever goods, let's say of T-shirts from China, how much will that set me back?
Well, roughly the cargo dues on an import container is over 2,000 rands on the import side. We actually have, over the years, we've noted from the studies that we've done that our cargo dues are much higher than the rest of the world. So we're in a process of bringing these down. The same thing with automotive vehicles that you're importing as well as exporting. It makes a difference, for example, whether a South African automotive plant gets the next model or not, depending on the export prices. For you, it could be the clothes that you're importing, the furniture, the tiles in your bathroom. It all makes a huge difference in people's lives. But beyond that, it makes a difference for the economy of South Africa in terms of jobs and manufacturing in South Africa, to be able to sell it overseas at a cheaper price. And as we add on prices on cargo dues, on port dues, and other shipping charges, of course South Africa is very far from some of its markets. the transport costs itself are high. So if you can bring down those prices, which is what we're trying to do, it actually helps for the industrial development of South Africa, as well as just you and I as consumers being able to get things cheaper.
And just as a split, if you're able to tell me this, as far as entrepreneurs go and just small to medium enterprise business people as opposed to the bigger corporates, what's the sort of split in terms of the import of goods into this particular harbour?
I'm not sure exactly. We don't follow things up at that level, but it is pretty significant, and this is why we do a tariff assessment every year, so that the smaller people who are in business for a shorter space of time will then accrue the correct price, and that the price adjustments then apply to them in a way that makes sense to their business.
And just for someone who's thinking of perhaps entering, this side of business in terms of bringing their stuff in through ports, maybe upscaling in terms of what they're doing right now, what sort of advice would you have for them?
I think, it's very lucrative in South Africa. We are actually trying to ensure that the overall pricing comes down. But we do try to maintain a bias towards exports rather than imports. For the reason that it keeps people in the factories able to do business with the rest of the world. So exports in South Africa are cross-subsidized by imports in some ways. So the price of a container coming in, the cargo dues would be about 70% higher than on the export box. So we try to maintain that kind of differential to make South Africa more competitive and to allow people to retain their jobs, whether it's in the automotive sector in East London or Port Elizabeth or Pretoria, and all other manufactured goods. We try to actually ensure that there is this differential.
Well, Mr. Mahesh Fakir, thanks so much for speaking to us from the port regulator in South Africa, their chief executive officer, and very interesting. So it does make sense, doesn't it? You'd rather have people exporting rather than importing, because when you do export, it means that we do create more jobs, and that's one of the issues that will be under the spotlight here at the inaugural Maritime Dialogue session. We're going to hand it back to studio now. We're going to go to a spot break, and after that we'll have the news with Leanne.